Today we are looking at a case from the end of the 19th century. So sit back as we go to England. Kate Webster was born Catherine Lawler in 1849 in the small village of Culzean, in County Wexford, Ireland. Little is known of her earliest years, though she grew up in a rural farming community where opportunities for young women were scarce. And from a young age, she showed a willingness to take what she wanted through dishonest means rather than through honest labor. While still only a teenager, she stole enough money to pay for a ferry crossing and made her way to Liverpool, where she continued stealing almost as soon as she arrived. This earned her a 4-year prison sentence at the age of just 18. On her release, Kate traveled south to London and began taking work as a domestic servant, though she quickly developed a habit of helping herself to her employer's belongings before moving on to the next position. She used several names during this period, including Webster and her birth name, Lawler, and would later claim to have married a sea captain by that surname, though there is considerable doubt as to whether such a marriage ever took place. In 1873, Kate settled for a time in the Hammersmith area of London, at Rose Gardens, where her next-door neighbors were a couple named Henry and Ann Porter. The Porters got on well with her, unaware of how significant their acquaintance would later become. Kate then moved on to work as a cook and housekeeper for a man known as Captain Woolbest in Notting Hill, and it was during this employment that she began a relationship with a man named Strong. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son on the 19th of April, 1874, only to be abandoned by the child's father soon afterwards. With no means of supporting herself or her child, Kate returned to her old habits of theft and served further terms of imprisonment as a result, including a 12-month sentence at Wandsworth Prison in 1877, the very institution where her life would eventually come to an end. A fellow domestic servant named Sarah Crease became a close friend during this period and cared for Kate's young son whenever his mother found herself behind bars. By the start of 1879, Kate Webster was once again in need of work and had settled in the Richmond area of southwest London, a quiet and respectable suburb on the banks of the River Thames. Richmond at the time was considered one of the more genteel districts on the outskirts of the capital, a place of tidy villas and orderly streets, far removed in character from the poverty and disorder often associated with London's more crowded quarters. It was here, through the introduction of a local acquaintance, that Kate came to the attention of a widow named Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, who was in need of a live-in maid. Mrs. Thomas lived alone at No. 2 Vine Cottages on Park Road, Richmond. She was in her mid-50s, twice widowed, and had previously worked as a schoolteacher. Those who knew her described her as comfortably off, though rather eccentric and excitable in temperament, and she had a reputation locally for being a demanding employer. Before Kate's arrival, she had found it difficult to keep any servant in her employment for very long. On the 13th of January, 1879, Kate Webster entered Mrs. Thomas's service. For a short while, the two women appeared to get along reasonably well, and Kate would later say that she believed she could be happy working in the household. It was not long, however, before the quality of her work began to slip, and her frequent visits to the local public houses started to irritate her employer. After a number of reprimands, Mrs. Thomas decided she could no longer keep Kate in her service and gave her notice, with her dismissal due to take effect on Friday, the 28th of February. This decision, though understandable, would prove to be a fatal one. During the weeks of notice, Mrs. Thomas grew increasingly uneasy in Kate's company, so much so that she began asking friends from her local church, as well as relatives, to come and stay with her in the house. When the 28th of February finally arrived, Kate had still not found new employment or lodgings of her own, and she pleaded with Mrs. Thomas to be allowed to remain in the house over the coming weekend. Mrs. Thomas, perhaps out of pity or simply exhaustion, agreed to let her stay a little longer, a decision that would ultimately cost Mrs. Thomas her life. On the morning of Sunday, the 2nd of March, 1879, Mrs. Thomas attended church as she did every week. Kate was permitted her usual Sunday afternoon off, and she used the time to visit her young son, who remained in the care of Sarah Creese, before stopping at a public house on her way back to Vine Cottages. She returned home later than expected, which greatly inconvenienced Mrs. Thomas, who was due to leave shortly afterwards for the evening service. A sharp exchange took place between the two women before Mrs. Thomas hurried off so as not to be late for church. Fellow worshippers later remarked that she appeared agitated and unsettled that evening, and it was thought she may have been growing suspicious that her home, and possibly her possessions, were not safe in Kate's hands. Whatever the cause, Mrs. Thomas left the service early and made her way home alone, without asking any of her companions to accompany her. What happened next inside the walls of Vine Cottages was known only to Kate Webster, and her own later account of events would differ sharply from the conclusions eventually reached by investigators. According to Kate, an argument broke out between the two women almost as soon as Mrs. Thomas returned home, and in a fit of temper she pushed her mistress from the top of the staircase to the floor below. Believing that Mrs. Thomas had been seriously injured and fearing the consequences of what she had done, Kate said that she then seized her by the throat to stop her from screaming, and in the ensuing struggle choked the life out of her. The prosecution would later present a very different sequence of events, one supported far more convincingly by the physical evidence. It was thought that Kate had, in fact, been lying in wait for her employer's return, and had struck her with an axe before she ever reached the top of the stairs, causing her to fall, before finishing her off to silence any further cries. Whatever the precise sequence, by the time the struggle was over, Julia Martha Thomas was dead. Remarkably, the household's immediate next-door neighbor, a Mrs. Ives, later told police that she had heard the sound of a heavy fall from next door followed by silence, but thought nothing more of it at the time. With her employer's body lying in the house, Kate now faced the grim problem of disposal. Rather than fleeing the scene, as a more panicked or less calculating woman might have done, she resolved to dismember the body entirely and dispose of the remains piece by piece. Over the following day, using a razor, a meat saw, and kitchen knives, she carried out one of the most horrifying acts of butchery in the history of British crime. She severed the head with the razor and saw, hacked away the limbs, and set about boiling much of the flesh and the torso in the household's laundry copper, the very vessel ordinarily used for boiling linen. The internal organs she burned in the kitchen grate. It was later alleged, though never conclusively proven at trial, that she offered some of the rendered fat to neighbors and to local children, presenting it as ordinary dripping and lard for their bread. Mrs. Ives next door reported an unusual and unpleasant smell drifting from the house during this time, a smell she would only later understand the true cause of. Even Kate herself, hardened as she was said to have been disturbed by the sheer quantity of blood the task produced, yet she persisted with grim determination. She packed as much of the remains as she could fit into a wooden box, though the head and one of the feet would not fit inside, and she was forced to dispose of these separately. The spare foot she discarded on a nearby manure heap, while the head she placed inside a black bag. Kate spent the following 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, cleaning the house and settling into her new and audacious plan. On the Tuesday afternoon, dressed in one of Mrs. Thomas's own silk gowns and carrying the black bag containing the head, she traveled to Hammersmith to visit her old acquaintances, the Porter family. She told them that an aunt had recently died and left her a house in Richmond, together with its contents, and that as she intended to return to Ireland, she wished to sell the property and everything inside it. She asked Henry Porter whether he knew of anyone who could help her find a buyer. During the course of the evening, both Henry Porter and his teenage son Robert took turns helping Kate carry the heavy black bag as the group moved between the railway station and 2 public houses, each of them remarking privately on just how heavy it seemed to be. Later that night, Kate excused herself, saying she needed to visit another friend, and returned some time afterwards without the bag. It was never found, And to this day, the location of Julia Martha Thomas's head at that time remains a mystery that would only be solved more than a century later. This left Kate with one final task: disposing of the wooden box containing the rest of the remains. She enlisted the help of young Robert Porter once again, and together the two of them carried the heavy box towards Richmond Bridge on the night of the 4th of March. Kate told Robert that a friend would shortly be along to collect it, and sent the young man on ahead. Moments later, he heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy striking the water below. Kate soon caught up with him again, the box gone, thrown from the bridge into the dark waters of the River Thames. The following morning, a coal man walking along the riverbank at Barnes came upon the wooden box, which had washed up close to the shore. What he found inside horrified him, and he reported the discovery at once to Inspector Harbour at Barnes Police Station. A local doctor who examined the remains confirmed that they belonged to a woman, and noted with some puzzlement that the skin bore clear signs of having been boiled. Without the head, however, there was no way for investigators to identify who the unfortunate victim might have been, and for a time the case remained an unsolved curiosity, quickly dubbed the Barnes mystery by the newspapers. Remarkably, Julia Martha Thomas had not yet even been reported missing. Kate, meanwhile, continued her deception with extraordinary confidence, presenting herself around Richmond as Mrs. Thomas herself and wearing her dead employer's clothes and jewelry. She kept up the pressure on Henry Porter to help her find a buyer for the house and its contents, and he duly introduced her to a local publican and general dealer named John Church. Kate and Church quickly struck up a friendship of their own, meeting several times to discuss the sale and drinking together in the process. An agreement was reached, and Church arranged for the furniture and some of Mrs. Thomas's clothing to be removed from Vine Cottages. This activity, however, did not go unnoticed. The removal of the furniture aroused the suspicion of the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ives, who began asking questions about what exactly was going on. During this period, Church's wife discovered a purse and a diary belonging to the real Mrs. Thomas hidden among the clothing, along with a letter addressed from a Mr. Menhennick, a personal acquaintance of Mrs. Thomas. Henry Porter and John Church decided to pay Menhennick a visit, and in the course of their conversation it became disturbingly clear that the remains found in the box at Barnes might well belong to a woman that Menhennick himself knew personally. The three men, together with Menhennick's solicitor, went at once to Richmond Police Station to lay out their growing suspicions. The following day, officers searched number 2 Vine Cottages from top to bottom. Inside, they recovered an axe, a razor, and a quantity of charred bone fragments from the grate, along with the missing handle from the very box that had already been pulled from the river days earlier. The connection was now unmistakable, and on the 23rd of March, 1879, police issued a full description of Kate Webster in relation to the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. By this time, however, Kate had already vanished from Richmond, taking her young son with her and fleeing back across the Irish Sea to the home of her uncle in the village of Culzean, the very place where she had grown up. It was inevitably the very first place that the police looked for her. On the 28th of March, 1879, officers acting on information from Scotland Yard arrived at the farm and placed her under arrest. She was found still wearing several of Mrs. Thomas's rings. Crowds gathered along the route as she was taken under guard from Enniscorthy towards Dublin, jeering and craning for a glimpse of the woman whose crime had already begun to horrify readers on both sides of the Irish Sea. Kate was brought back to England by way of Holyhead and taken directly to Richmond Police Station, where on the 30th of March she made a formal statement. In it, she attempted to shift the blame for the killing squarely onto John Church, the very publican who had bought Mrs. Thomas's furniture from her and who had, in fact, assisted the police in bringing the case together. Church was duly arrested and questioned, but he was able to produce a solid alibi for the afternoon of the murder and was quickly released. Undeterred, Kate then made a second accusation, this time against Henry Porter, but his alibi likewise held firm. With both men cleared of any wrongdoing, suspicion settled entirely upon Kate Webster, and she was formally charged with the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. The case, now widely known in the press as the Barnes Mystery or the Richmond Murder, caused an extraordinary sensation across Britain and Ireland. Newspapers dwelled at length on the horror of the dismemberment and the boiling of the remains, calling it one of the most gruesome crimes within living memory. The betrayal of trust between a servant and her mistress, a relationship regarded in Victorian domestic life as one of near sacred obligation, only deepened the public's fascination and outrage. Kate's trial opened on the 2nd of July, 1879 at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, before Mr. Justice Denman. Given the seriousness of the crime, the prosecution was led personally by the Solicitor General, Sir Hardinge Giffard, while Kate was defended by the barrister Mr. Warner Slay. Interest in the case had reached such a pitch that the courtroom was crowded to capacity throughout the 6 days of proceedings, and on one occasion the future King of Sweden, Crown Prince Gustav, was among those who came to observe. The prosecution built its case methodically. A hat maker named Mary Durden told the court that as early as the 25th of February, 6 days before the murder, Kate had already spoken to her of traveling to Birmingham to take charge of property and jewelry supposedly left to her by a deceased aunt. Evidence, the prosecution argued, pointed clearly towards premeditation. Both Henry Porter and John Church gave detailed evidence describing their dealings with Kate in the days following the murder, while the judge, in summing up, made a point of noting the previously good character of both men, further undermining Kate's attempts to implicate them. One of the greatest difficulties facing the prosecution was the absence of Mrs. Thomas's head, without which there could be no absolute means of identifying the remains found at Barnes. The defense sought to exploit this weakness, suggesting instead that Mrs. Thomas might have died of entirely natural causes, pointing to the agitated state in which she had last been seen leaving church that Sunday evening. Medical witnesses, however, testified that all of the recovered body parts belonged to a single woman in her 50s, consistent in every respect with Julia Martha Thomas. Two of Kate's own friends, Sarah Creese and a woman named Lucy Loader, appeared as character witnesses on her behalf, describing her as being of a generally good and kindly nature. When confronted directly in court with John Church, Kate turned on him dramatically, pointing and declaring loudly that he was the true murderer, an accusation that startled the courtroom but which carried no weight given his already established alibi. Late in the afternoon of Tuesday, the 8th of July, after 6 days of evidence, the jury retired to consider its verdict. They returned a little over an hour later, finding Kate Webster guilty of murder. Before sentence was passed, she once again denied the charge outright, though she was careful this time to clear both Church and Porter of any involvement in the killing. Asked, as was customary, whether she had anything further to say before sentence was pronounced, Kate claimed that she was pregnant, a declaration that, if true, would under the law of the time have required her execution to be postponed. A panel of matrons, drawn from among the women present in the courtroom, was assembled to examine her, and after careful assessment they found no truth whatsoever to the claim. Mr. Justice Denman proceeded to pass sentence of death. Kate was transferred first to Newgate Prison and then, the following day, to Wandsworth to await her execution, guarded around the clock by teams of female prison officers. While awaiting her fate, she made 2 further confessions, one of which attempted to place the blame for her circumstances upon Strong, the father of her son, though this too was found to be without substance. Despite a small degree of public agitation calling for her sentence to be commuted, Kate was informed by her solicitor that no reprieve would be granted. On the evening before her execution, in the presence of her solicitor and the Catholic priest attending her, Father McHenry, she finally offered an account of the murder that came far closer to the truth, describing the quarrel with Mrs. Thomas, the fall down the stairs, and her decision to silence her mistress for good rather than risk being caught. She told those present that she was resigned to her fate, and that she would rather face execution than continue to live a life built upon deception and misery. On the morning of Tuesday, the 29th of July, 1879, Kate Webster was led from her cell across the prison yard to the execution shed at Wandsworth, accompanied by Father McHenry and watched over by two female wardresses. She was only the second person, and the only woman, ever to be hanged within the walls of Wandsworth Prison. The executioner, William Marwood, a pioneer of the so-called long drop method designed to bring about a swift and less agonizing death than the methods of old, secured her in place upon the trapdoor. Her final words, spoken quietly, were a simple plea for mercy upon her soul. Moments later, the trapdoor fell, and the case that had gripped Britain and Ireland for months came to its end. Kate's body was left to hang for the customary hour before being taken down and buried within the prison grounds in an unmarked grave, a spot that, unlike many others at Wandsworth, would never be reused for a later burial. As she was a woman, no newspaper reporters were permitted to witness the execution itself, though illustrated papers of the day still produced dramatic depictions of the scene as they imagined it to have unfolded. The mystery surrounding the case, however, did not end with Kate Webster's death. The severed head of Julia Martha Thomas, carried away and disposed of separately by Kate on that Tuesday evening in March 1879, remained lost for more than a century. It was not until October 2010 that workmen carrying out building works in Richmond, on land connected with the naturalist Sir David Attenborough, unearthed a skull buried in the garden close to where Kate had once frequented a public house. Forensic examination confirmed fractures consistent with a fall down a staircase, along with signs that the skull had at some point been boiled, finally allowing investigators, more than 130 years later, to confirm what had long been suspected, and to bring the last physical trace of the Barnes mystery to rest. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Black Cases.